Testing. Can y'all hear me okay? All right, I think it's about time, so I'm going to get started. So I'm getting over a cold, so if my voice is a little froggy, that's why. But hopefully I'll get through it and y'all will be able to understand me at least. All right, let's get into it. So in keeping with this being the first Sunday of Advent, I'm going to continue my Bible in Place and Time series by talking about the intertestamental period leading up to the birth of Jesus. And, Joseph mentioned this morning about how part of anticipating, part of the Advent season is reflecting on what it would have been like for ancient people, people in ancient Judea, to anticipate Jesus's birth. And so part of what I'm going to do today is try to give you some context for the different groups who lived in the intertestamental period up until the time of Jesus, and how the different groups might have responded to his birth and been affected by it. So, we left off in the Old Testament, and of course the last book in the Christian Old Testament is Malachi, and that ends with the anticipation of the Messiah, that Malachi anticipated the return of a prophet like Elijah who would usher in the day of the Lord. And that became part of the messianic anticipation that we believe was fulfilled through Christ. But Malachi took place somewhere around 430 or 420 BC. And so that's a lot of time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's easy to just kind of skip over that or assume that nothing really important happened. But actually quite a bit happened that is really useful to know when we go from reading the Old Testament to the New Testament. Now, the reason the Bible doesn't address that period is that it's believed that God didn't send any prophets to speak to the people, and so there were no writings that were inspired in the way that we believe that Scripture was. But there were writings pertaining to that period, and a whole lot going on. And so I'm going to discuss some of that today and help us contextualize the time of the early church and the birth of Jesus. So if you remember from my Old Testament talks, the last time we left Judea, the Jews had returned to the land, or at least some Jews had returned to the land and reestablished the temple, but there was no king. They were still under the control of the Persian Empire. And that situation would continue for a long time. There was a whole series of empires who controlled the land that you can see listed here. You don't have to know all those dates or even remember all of them. But it's good to remember that for 400 years, well, for about 300 years anyway, they were a completely subjugated people. So our main sources for this period include the Jewish historian Josephus, the biblical Apocrypha, and a group of writings called the Old Testament pseudepigrapha, as well as archaeology. And so Judea goes from being under the control of the Persian Empire to being under the control of the Greek Empire following Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, the empire splintered and was controlled, parts of it were controlled by his generals. And so all throughout this period, Judea was under the control of the Greek Empire. And they got by all right for the most part. A lot of people were not happy being subjugated, of course, but they went along with their lives and their traditions until the Greeks went too far, and the Greek king banned Jewish practices and banned their traditional temple worship, and instead ordered a pagan altar built in the temple courtyard. And so I don't know why they thought that was a good idea, but it didn't work out for them because a man from the priestly tribe who was a leader of a family that would be called the Hasmoneans. His name was Mattathias. And in 167 BC, after the Greeks had built this pagan altar, they were going to force a Jewish priest to sacrifice, profane sacrifice on this pagan altar in the temple court. And Mattathias stepped in and killed the apostate priest and killed the Greek soldiers who were forcing him to do that. And he kicked off a rebellion, and his sons and their heirs after them became known as the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. And after some fighting, they were able to reestablish independence from the Greeks. They were able to push them out, and they exercised a degree of independence for the first time in almost 300 years. So that was a huge event in the history in early Judaism. The celebration of Hanukkah actually represents rededicating the temple after they had driven the Greeks out. So that's how important this period was, that it became associated with one of the hugely important Jewish traditions. So the Hasmoneans made the mistake of allying with the Romans. This was kind of the same thing that Hezekiah did, where his enemy was the Assyrians, and so he got friendly with the Babylonians, who were their rivals. And if you'll remember that episode, the Babylonians come back and wipe out the Judeans. Somewhat similar situation with the bargain they made with the Romans. The Romans were a great ally against the Greeks, and they did help them regain their independence, but ultimately they would fall under Roman control the same way they had fallen under Greek control. During this period, multiple important groups emerged that would either appear in the New Testament or were peripheral to the New Testament but important. And so they emerged during this period, and I'm going to discuss them briefly because they're all an important part of the story. So there were several Jewish groups, and some of them you'll be familiar with from the biblical stories. The first is the Pharisees, and they seem to have been more associated with synagogue traditions than with the temple traditions. And Josephus talks about how they were kind of the more popular, almost like populist group. They were more of the people. Jesus has a lot of uncomplimentary things to say about the Pharisees. Of course, the famous condemnation of them as whitewashed tombs. And pictured here are tombs that would have been visible in Jerusalem in that time, that some people think he may have been referencing them, that those tombs may have even been visible from where he was speaking. So that's kind of cool. But we might assume that Jesus and the early Christians were the polar opposite of the Pharisees, given how strongly he condemned them. But actually, that was probably the closest sect to, like, Jesus probably grew up among the Pharisees. We see him teaching in the synagogue, which tended to be a Pharisee thing. And of course, he believed in life after death. That was also a Pharisee belief. So rather than these like polar opposite rivals, we might see it more like the Baptists and the even more serious Baptists that are gonna fight, because, or closer to home, the Wesleyans and the Methodists. So the next important group among the early Jews were the Sadducees, and unlike the Pharisees, so the Pharisees accepted traditions outside of Scripture, and many of those traditions would develop into the Jewish traditions that continue to be practiced today. The Sadducees only believed what was in Scripture. So we might see them kind of like a Christian restoration movement. Sometimes you'll hear people say, we need to throw out all this tradition and go back and be like the early church. That's kind of a Sadducee. That's kind of a Sadducee approach. They took a similar approach to their traditions, that if it wasn't in the Torah, they didn't accept it. And so, because life after death and the resurrection is not explicitly in the Torah, they didn't believe in that. And they were probably more associated with the establishment religion and with the temple, like the official temple religion, as opposed to the Pharisees, who were more popular. You almost might think of it as like the establishment church of like bishops and all of that structure versus like the Congregationalist preacher. It was perhaps somewhat like that. Those two groups were complementary to an extent. Just because you were a Pharisee didn't mean you wouldn't you wouldn't worship in the temple, you would. So there was a lot of overlap, but I suspect there was also a degree of rivalry because they had quite different beliefs and they had different sort of power structures that they were appealing to. And so that's an important distinction to keep in mind when we're thinking about the different groups that made up first century Judea. Another group doesn't really appear in the Bible, but they were an important part of the culture, and they're important to the conversation because they're often associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so this was the Essenes. We also know about these guys from Josephus. He writes a lot about them. If you're interested, you can find all of his writings online, and he writes all about their practices and traditions. But suffice it to say, they were kind of a separatist movement, and also kind of like a monastic movement. So think like somewhere between the Branch Davidians and the Jesuits, depending on like how accepting you are of them. And I imagine the different people in the establishment might have had that broad of a perspective on them. Like, to some people, they may have seemed like dangerous, potentially subversive separatists, whereas to other people, they might have just been like these desert monks out doing their thing and being harmless. But they seem to have lived a monastic type of lifestyle where they had shared housing. Some of this we know from Josephus's writings about them, and some of it has been surmised by studying Qumran, which this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and it's commonly associated with the Essenes. We know from ancient writings that the Essenes had a community on the west side of the Dead Sea. Well, that's where Qumran is. There's not really another good candidate for that. So it's not universally accepted that the people who lived at Qumran were Essenes, but it's pretty commonly accepted. That's not that controversial. And so they seem to have lived a communal lifestyle where they didn't seem to hold much, if any, personal property, and they seemed to take communal meals. So very much a monastic type life. It's unclear exactly what the relationship between the Dead Sea Scrolls and this community was. That's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the caves surrounding this little community. So Qumran is perched on the ridge of a hill. You can kind of see that in this picture. There's another picture later where that'll be clearer. But this little monastery, or whatever we want to call it, is perched on a hill with valleys around it, and in the valleys are lots of caves, and that's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you're not familiar with that, that's the earliest surviving Hebrew scriptures that has most of what's in the Torah or the Old Testament, but it's 1,000 years or more older than what had previously been the oldest manuscripts, so hugely important to biblical scholars. It's kind of funny, you assume that it's super important to archaeologists, but we're more likely to argue about the pots that they were found in than the actual scrolls. But the scrolls seem pretty clearly to have been associated with them in some way. The two common theories are either that they were written there, that these monk-type guys were engaged in writing out the scrolls and copying them. But another possibility is just that it was their library, that they had collected it. You know, that most churches have a library, and being a religious community like this, dedicated to Scripture, it seems quite likely that they would have had a library. So that may be the relationship of the Dead Sea Scrolls to Qumran. All that is not as pertinent to the world of Jesus' birth, but that's just such a famous discovery and such a famous topic that I thought I should address it to some extent, or I figured I would get questions on it. And you're welcome to ask more questions at the end if you'd like. I've been there a bunch of times, and I've explored around the cliffs overlooking it, and so I'd be happy to talk about Dead Sea Scroll stuff if you want later. So the fourth Jewish group who's important to this period are the Zealots. They're somewhat analogous to the Maccabees from a couple centuries earlier. So just like the Maccabees threw off Greek rule and reestablished an independent Judea, the Jewish Zealots during the Roman period, they wanted to do the same thing. So again, they would be perceived very differently depending on who you ask. They're either terrorists or patriotic freedom fighters, depending on whose perspective you're going from. But they were an important group and represented a major challenge to Roman rule and a major challenge to the status quo. So I think they would have made almost everyone a little nervous. Because if you're the Romans, they would have been a direct threat to you, but also most people would have benefited in some way or other from Roman rule. So even the people who really weren't crazy about the Romans were probably not real excited about the prospect of these guys stabbing random centurions, because that's not going to help. That's not going to help anybody in the short run. Interestingly, some of the Zealots were called Sicarii, which is named after a type of knife or a type of dagger. We actually still, the word Sicario, which refers to like a type of assassin, it derives from that. But some people think that Judas Iscariot was one of the Sicarii, because it sounds quite similar. It might have been something like Judas the assassin, Judas Iscariot. And so it's possible that one of Jesus's apostles was from this group, or possibly more than one, because they're pretty quick to draw swords when the Romans come to take Jesus. But yeah, this is another important group to be aware of. An additional group is not a Jewish group, but they're related. The Samaritans, so according to Josephus, the Samaritans are the descendants of the people whom the Assyrians brought in after they depopulated Israel and Samaria. Do you remember that from, I guess it would have been my second lecture? When the northern tribes of Israel are destroyed and the people are scattered, the Assyrians scatter the Israelites throughout their empire and bring foreigners in to populate the land in the middle of the country where they had previously lived. I suspect that's only partly true. I think the Samaritans were actually a combination of people the Assyrians brought in, but also Israelites who remained in the land, because so if they were all foreigners, we would expect them to have some completely foreign religion, from Persia or Assyria or Anatolia or who knows where. But rather than that, the Samaritans practiced a version of the Hebrew religion. They have their own Pentateuch, just like the Hebrews did, but rather than being written in Hebrew, it's written in Samaritan. But it's very similar. There are a series of key differences, the most significant being that the Hebrews sacrificed on Mount Zion, which they believed they saw as their holy mountain, whereas the Samaritans sacrificed on Mount Gerizim in the hill country far north of Jerusalem. But they followed traditions that were very close to the ancient Hebrews, and they actually still do, which I think is really fascinating. There's that is Mount Gerizim and the temple, which still stands there. It doesn't date clear back to this time, it's much newer, but there is still a Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, and there's a community of, 1,000 or so Samaritans who still live in the immediate area and still practice their religion and sacrifice on Mount Gerizim. So I didn't know that until just a few years ago. I think that's fascinating. But they were another important group in first century Judea, and they show up a lot in the Gospels because they represent a direct rival to the Jews, who of course Jesus and the apostles come from that tradition, and the Samaritans were sort of the quintessential outsider, and part of the reason for that animosity is that John Hyrcanus, who is one of the Hasmonean leaders, destroyed the Samaritan temple in 128 BC, and some people think that was actually when the schism between Jews and Samaritans really started, or at least that it really became much deeper at that time. Like before this, it's possible that Jews in Jerusalem might have seen the Samaritans as sort of like their weird semi-heretical cousins that they don't invite to the family barbecue, but they didn't have they may not have had the level of animosity that we see in the New Testament times. And like I say, that divide was certainly deepened, if not begun, when the Hasmoneans destroyed their temple in 128. So that pretty much covers the different groups that we need to be aware of. or at least the locals, because we also have the Romans. And the Romans are going to be the ultimate outsiders, and they're overlords to and threats to all of the groups that we've discussed so far. And it's actually the Romans who put Herod on the throne. The Hasmoneans had ruled as priests. Some of them might have called themselves king. That's kind of disputed, but largely they ruled Judea as a theocracy. Well, in 40 BC, the Hasmoneans are involved in a kind of a civil war. There's a dispute over who's the rightful ruler. And that's when the Romans step in and depose the Hasmoneans who had been ruling Judea. And it's the Romans who anoint Herod as king of Judea in 40 BC. And so this is the Herod we know from the Nativity story. The paranoid king who orders all of the babies in Bethlehem to be killed, so that in an attempt to remove Jesus as a threat to his legitimacy. And the Herod that we know from history makes that story pretty believable. He's called Herod the Great, and in many ways he was great, but like Voldemort and Harry Potter, he was great but terrible. Is that the line? Yeah. My wife's the Harry Potter fan, so. So first of all, Herod was not ethnically Jewish. So there's a king on the throne in Judea once again, and I imagine that would have been comforting to many of the Jews to have a level of independence after after facing the threat of once again being directly under Roman occupation. So he was the king, but he wasn't actually Jewish. He was Idumean, a descendant of the Edomites, who you might remember from the Old Testament, an ancient rival to the Hebrews. So Herod is king, but he's not ethnically Jewish, and I think people would have had very mixed feelings about him, because on the one hand, he restored dignity to Judea. He rebuilt the temple and restored it to something like its former glory, from the time of Solomon. But he was also very friendly with the Romans. This city is Caesarea Maritima. So Herod built this city. It's a classical city built in the Roman style, which Herod built in honor of Caesar. So he wanted to make it very clear to the Romans that he was a good, obedient Roman subject, but at the same time he was trying to make it clear to the different early Jewish factions that he was also the legitimate Jewish king. That would have been a tricky line to walk. So he built this Roman-style city to make Caesar happy. He also built We think he built this temple. This is a little temple up in the northern part of the country called Omrit. That's me standing on a column when I was much younger and thinner. I don't think I could get up on that column now. But he built this neat little Roman temple, or at least he may have built this in honor of Caesar as well. There's some debate over who built it and why, as with most things in archaeology. It's up north, close to Dan. It's actually, I actually think it might have been a border shrine to Caesarea Philippi, because it's right. It's close to Caesarea Philippi and also Dan up north in that area. So Herod probably built this in honor of Caesar, although that's debated. When I said it's believable that he would have had all the children of a town killed in order to protect his rule, these fortresses kind of illuminate how cautious he was. He put a lot of work into protecting himself from his enemies, and he had a lot of enemies because he was quite a ruthless politician. So he built a whole series of palace fortresses in the wilderness, so that if he were attacked, he could flee to any of them and live out his days in relative comfort while still being protected from his enemies. The most famous is probably Masada on the right there, and of course that's famous for being the last holdout of the Roman revolt, or the Jewish revolt against Rome after Jesus' time. But that was built by Herod as one of his palace fortresses, and it's the most impressive because it's way out in the middle of nowhere in the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea, with a stark drop on every side. So it looks like a ship rising up out of the desert, and it was impenetrable. When the Romans finally took it, I think it took them more than a year to build a siege ramp and besiege the city. Herod overbuilt, but it paid off in some instances. The one on the left is called the Herodium. That's another palace fortress, and the columns in the foreground were kind of his entertaining palace. There was actually a swimming pool there, but what looks like a flattened hill in the background is his actual personal fortress palace, and it's partially hollow, and there would have been a huge tower standing several stories above that flattened hill when it was new. But it's magnificent. It's possibly even more impressive than Masada in some ways, just because of the sheer engineering involved. But that gives you some idea of the tense situation of the times, given how much effort Herod put into to securing his hold on the throne. But that kind of reflects how tenuous it may have been. So these are the different groups that we should keep in mind when we're trying to think of what it would have been like to anticipate the Messiah. All these different people would have had very different expectations of what the Messiah would have been like. I imagine they all would have expected the Messiah to be more like them than the other groups. And so Jesus would undermine all those expectations. He wasn't going to be a traditional king who was going to make war and drive out his enemies. So he undermined everybody's expectations, but he still represented a huge threat to this power structure. There's this complex network of relationships between these groups that are all, they're all related to one another and to the Roman authorities in different ways. And so when Jesus comes, I think this world was ripe for being overturned. And the birth of Jesus would do that. So now back to the nativity story. So we see something of Jesus's kind of subversive nature in Mary's Magnificat, which of course there's much more to it than this, but I thought this line was particularly pertinent to kind of the power structure that we've been studying, that he's brought down rulers from their thrones, but he's lifted up the humble. Well, we've just been studying a lot of rulers and a lot of humble people who would have been impacted in very different ways by the gospel. But before Jesus arrives, John the Baptist precedes him. And we see him as the prophet like Elijah, who Malachi had predicted. So he would be the first prophet for over 400 years after this silent period between the Testaments. And so he would prepare the way for Jesus and for the gospel. And so we all know the story, and I'm drawing mostly from the Gospel of Luke for the rest of this discussion. The angel Gabriel appears to Mary in Nazareth and tells her that she'll give birth to the Messiah, even though she's a virgin, she will be blessed by God to bear the Messiah. And this church stands in Nazareth. It's called the Basilica of the Annunciation, and this is the traditional location of where the angel appeared to Mary. The church you see here is not that old. I think they built it maybe 60 years ago. It's not a very old church at all, especially by the standards of this region. But under the modern church is this ancient cave, which now serves as a chapel within the larger modern church. And this is the traditional site of the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary. And of course, it's impossible to know that there's no direct evidence of that, but it does it's in the right place, and it has a long tradition of being the site where the angel appeared to Mary and first told her the news of the gospel. So after that, of course, we have Mary and Joseph being called up to register for the Roman census. And so they'll travel south from Nazareth down to Jerusalem, or down to Bethlehem, because Joseph is from the family of David, and Bethlehem is the town of David. And this, you might wonder why the route is so circuitous. Like, why not go straight down north to south from Nazareth to Bethlehem? It looks like a straight shot. Well, there's at least two reasons. One of them is geographical, which is that region is just kind of a rocky labyrinth of sheep trails. It would have been miserable to try to pick your way through there on foot. The second reason is political. That was where the Samaritans lived. And as we discussed, there was a lot of animosity between Jews and Samaritans in this period. So in addition to just being impractical to take that difficult road, it may not have been safe for a group of Jews on foot to travel hundreds of miles through the potentially hostile Samaritan region. And so they depart from Nazareth, and another site that we have in Nazareth that has a tradition linking it to the Holy Family is a convent. The convent was built on top of a Byzantine church, and the Byzantine church was built on top of this first century rock-hewn house, which is believed to have been where the Holy Family lived. So possibly this is where Joseph lived when he was called south to the census, and then when they returned there, and he and Mary married. You know, this may have been where Jesus spent his boyhood. Again, it's always almost impossible to link a specific place with a specific person in history, especially when it's, you know, the most important person in history. But it fits. It seems to be a first century house, and it has a very, very long history of being revered as a holy place by Christians. So maybe it's quite possible that this was where the Holy Family lived. And so they go from there, following that route we discussed, down to Nazareth. And this is the Church of the Nativity, which is an Orthodox church, and that preserves the traditional location of the birth of Christ. Many translations say that there was no room available in the inn, and so you assume that they were like looking for the first century equivalent of a Motel 6 and couldn't find one. But it actually, another option for translation is there was no space in the guest house, or there's no space in the house. And so a lot of people think that they stayed in a cave under the house. That would have been, it would have been kind of like if you had an unexpected in-law and there's no room in the main house, and you put them up in the garage. So it may have been something like that the cave of the Nativity may have been, you know, some relative's home, but where they kept their livestock, either adjacent to or possibly directly under the home. the house might have been built on top of this cave. But the cave still exists, and you can visit it. So picture on the left is the entrance. You walk down a flight of stairs, and it opens up a bit. There's a little bit of space behind here where you can stand. But this little shrine that you see here marks a silver star where you can actually reach down and touch the stone of the original cave, which is the traditional spot where Mary gave birth to Jesus. And so you can actually reach your hand in this hole in the silver and marble that surrounds the cave and touch the actual stone. So the next part of the story is the angel appearing to the shepherds. And that's an interesting detail considering what Mary said in her Magnificat about the great being pulled down and the humble being elevated, because shepherds were among the most humble of people. But also there was a long tradition of shepherding being kind of the ideal lifestyle from the Hebrew perspective. And David, of course, was a shepherd. So it's very fitting that the angel, the first people to receive news of the birth of Christ, were these humble working people, but they were working in a business that was highly esteemed in their culture and often portrayed as sort of the ideal life. So it's kind of an interesting mix of symbols going on there. But this church marks the traditional place where the angel is believed to have appeared to the shepherds. This is on the outskirts of Bethlehem, and there's also a series of caves there that still exist, and that is quite possibly where the shepherds would have kept their flocks for safety. There's another church built into one of the actual caves. I didn't get a picture of that, but it kind of just gives you an idea of the lay of the land and what life would have been like in this time. And it's not what we picture. Like a lot of us, when we hear about the nativity in the manger, we picture like a barn and a feed trough, the way we're accustomed to seeing. When we might picture the shepherds out in this like idyllic grassy little hill, but instead it's like this very rocky, very craggy, marginal area, and people made do with what was available, and what was available was often caves. So you would use caves for storage, for keeping livestock, sometimes even for living in. So that's another kind of just neat detail that, if you ever go to Bethlehem, you can visit these locations. And so the shepherds return to the cave of the Nativity, and the Gospel of Luke says that they found the baby lying in the manger, a feed trough for animals in this dirty, crowded little cave. And I don't know if you can really make it out in this picture, but that's where the manger is believed to have been. And so there's still kind of a trough, which is now, it's not the original one. This is all polished marble, carved polished marble that represents where the manger would have been. But again, you can go there and you can visit this, and walk through that cave and touch that stone. And it's just kind of cool to connect with the Bible stories like that. And so when Jesus is born, he's going to be hugely important in very different ways to all of these different communities that we've discussed. You have from shepherds to kings to emperors. You have these rival religious communities with different beliefs that sometimes overlap, sometimes complement one another, sometimes are in direct competition with one another. But they're all anticipating a Savior or living in fear of a leader rising to threaten their power. So all of these different groups would have anticipated Christ in very different ways. Many of them with hope, but many of them with a degree of fear, and with good reason, because Christ would completely upset the normal balance of powers. So as we go into this Advent season, I think it's really beneficial to reflect on all that. And I hope when you reread the Gospels and the Nativity story, that this maybe provides a little bit of background information that you may not have had, and also gives you some grounding of these real places that still exist that you can visit associated with this story. And so I hope that this is kind of a good little introduction to the Advent season that maybe helps you look at it in a bit of a different light. And that's all I have for this lecture. So I could have done. There's a lot I could do with the archaeology of the New Testament more broadly, but I thought this was enough to cover, and especially being that it's the beginning of Advent, I wanted to stay focused on the Nativity story. But if you're interested, I would be happy to do an additional lecture whenever is convenient, like maybe around Easter or something. I could do like archaeology of the New Testament and the early church potentially, because this has been some archaeology, but really more history and like Holy Land tour stuff. But there's a lot of really, really fascinating archaeology pertaining to the time of the Gospels in the early church. So if you're interested, I'll do another lecture addressing that stuff. But for now, that's all I've got, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I also brought a few books about the intertestamental period and early Judaism. So if anyone's interested in learning more about this period, I can give you some recommendations. So, yep.
Showed on the map the route from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Probably an hour when we drove, or an hour and a half. But any idea what that distance would have been then?
I don't really know. Let's see. I think multiple days, I would guess. I want to say it's maybe like 30 miles or so as the crow flies, but then you're talking like maybe more like 60 or even more miles, of actual road. And of course that's downhill and uphill, and so I would guess at least a week on foot. I would imagine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
When someplace like where Christ was born been so revered for so many years, there's got to be so many layers on top of the original stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It must be a real challenge for somebody like you to figure out, well, what was really originally there?
Oh, definitely. So for anyone who didn't hear, he made a comment about how many layers there would be on a holy site that's venerated over so many generations, and how that would pose difficulties to archaeologists. And that's definitely the case, especially since when it is an active holy site like that, um, we're very limited in the extent that we can do any archaeology. Occasionally there will be renovations and repairs, and then you can get in a bit and kind of find different levels of different stratigraphic levels and different phases of building. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy complicated. And a lot of these places, a lot of the Christian churches, they go back at least to the 3rd century, and many of them probably clear back to shortly after the time of Christ. So yeah, you have just a layer cake of different phases. But that's one of the things that's so cool when you can visit them. That you can be walking on stones that are 1,200 years old, and there might be some tomb that's 1,500 years old, and it's crazy the depth of history in some of these places.
That shrine is around where he was born. Have an idea of
Um,
where it's traditionally known, but
that's a great question. So she asked how old is the shrine around the Cave of the Nativity. I don't know. That's probably something that is known, because there's a lot of records around the history of these churches. I have a book that details the whole history of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, dating clear back to like Helena's time till now. I'm sure the same thing exists for the Church of the Nativity. So I don't actually know how old the current shrine is, but that information is probably out there. And that'd be interesting to look into. Well, any other questions or comments? If not, I'll call it quits and wish everybody a blessed Advent season, and I hope that this was a fun way to kick it off. And if anybody has any follow-up questions you want to ask me one-on-one, or any comments, I'll be around for a little while, so don't hesitate to come up and say hi.